Yeah, okay, it's okay now, Raymond, sorry.
Sorry for my lack of Russian. So we added this gene that was missing, replicated these cells, injected it back in the body, went through the bloodstream, and actually cured this disease. And this is now undergoing human trials. So this is just one example of many where we're actually reprogramming biology. Biology is inherently an information process. By the way, the Genome Project itself was a good example of this exponential growth I'm talking about. Halfway through the project, the critics were saying, this isn't working. You've only collected 1% of the genome after 7 years, which is half of the 15 years that was projected. 1%, 7 years, it's going to take 700 years, which is what we said originally. My reaction was, no, it's almost done, because it's an exponential trajectory. It's doubling every year. After 7 years, it had been doubling every time. 1% is only 7 doublings away from 100%. It continued to double every year, and the project was finished on time. And every other aspect of biology has continued to scale up exponentially. Now that we're treating it as an information technology. So these technologies, the ability to reprogram our genes, for example, are in an early stage, but these technologies are going to double in power every year, and they will be 1,000 times more powerful than they are in 10 years. They'll be 1,000,000 times more powerful than they are today in 20 years, and it will be a very different era. So let me show you just a few examples of how this works. I'll skip some of these slides since we have discussed a lot of these issues. Okay, so here's a good example. This graph over here. By the way, these are logarithmic scales, meaning every level on this graph is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. So a straight line is exponential growth. So that line actually represents trillions-fold increase over a century. Trillions-fold in what? This is actually measuring the number of bits we move around wirelessly in the world. So the power of communication technologies, wireless communication. 100 years ago, that was Morse code over AM radio. Today, it's 4G networks. But look at how smooth a trajectory that is. You would think that given all the vagaries of news, headlines, a billion-dollar company goes bankrupt, new products come out, one company takes over from another company, countries accused of dumping products, that this would be very erratic. I mean, look at how smooth the trajectory that is. So let me show you the one that I first discovered, which is this one. This is the power of computers, going back to the 1890 American census. And every level on this is a logarithmic scale, every level on this graph is 100,000 times greater than the level below it. So this represents trillions-fold increase over, a little over a century. Several billion-fold just since I was an undergraduate. And a lot of people say, well, you can't just take exponentials and project them out indefinitely, because, well, it takes these exponentials and projects them out, and every exponential comes to an end. Well, in information technology, a particular method will come to an end, but it leads to research pressure to create the next method. Moore's law, which is the shrinking of component sizes on a chip, was not the first paradigm to bring exponential growth to computing. This started decades before Gordon Moore was even born. Chips was the fifth paradigm, not the first. In the 1950s, we were shrinking vacuum tubes, making them smaller and smaller. In 1952, CBS predicted the election of Eisenhower, the American president. First time the American networks did that. Then they were making the vacuum tubes smaller and smaller every year. Finally, they couldn't shrink them anymore and keep the vacuum, and that was the end of the shrinking of vacuum tubes. It was not the the end of this exponential growth. It just went to another method, transistors and foundries and chips. But again, look at how smooth a trajectory that is. It's not affected by anything. It was not affected by the Great Depression that swept the world in the 1930s. It was not affected by World War I or World War II or by the Cold War or any of the events of the 20th century or 21st century. People say, well, the recent recession must have slowed it down. No, it's continued without stopping at all through the recent economic problems. And it's really remarkable how smooth a trajectory that is. So I don't dwell on these examples of electronics, but up there, the cost of a transistor, you could buy one transistor for $1 in 1968. I remember being in college and being very excited. Wow, I could get a whole transistor for only $1. Today, you can get several billion for $1, and they're actually better because they're smaller, therefore they're faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half in less than a year. That represents a 50% deflation rate. Economists actually worry about deflation. The concern is that as everything becomes information technology, you can get the same stuff a year later for half the price. You will buy more, that's an economic reality, but you're not going to double your consumption. So therefore the size of the economy as measured in rubles or dollars will shrink. And for actually a variety of good reasons that would not be a good thing. That's actually not what we see. This is bits of memory shipped, but I could show you 50 other graphs like this. We actually more than double our consumption every year. Because as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode. People didn't buy iPods for $10,000 each, which is what it would have cost 15 years ago. When the price performance is there, whole new capabilities, search engines, fax machines, digital cameras, social networks take off. And that's actually represents 18% growth in constant currency, even though we can get twice as much capability each year for the same price. I mentioned the biotechnology revolution. This is, again, a very smooth doubling every year. The cost has come down by half every year, and many other aspects of biology are also scaling up in this exponential manner. Communication technologies. This little graph here I had in the early 80s. I had just a few points on that graph. And I projected out what I said would be a worldwide web of communication connecting hundreds of millions of people around the world to each other and to vast knowledge resources emerging by the late 90s. And people thought that was crazy, when in the early 80s, the entire American defense budget could only tie together 2,000 scientists. But that's the power of exponential growth. That's what happened. This graph on the right is the same data, but seen on a linear scale rather than a logarithmic scale. So it's the same information, but it looks like to the casual observer that the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s. But you could see it coming if you looked into this exponential trajectory. We're shrinking technology. I mentioned that this computer in my pocket is 100,000 times smaller than when I used it as a student. We can now actually manufacture things just from information using three-dimensional printers and very inexpensive input materials. So if I want to send you a book or a music album or a movie, I can send you an email attachment and you can read a book or a movie or a sound recording. But I can also send you a violin. If you have a three-dimensional printer, you can print it out. Now, three-dimensional printers have been expensive. They've just a few years ago cost tens of thousands of dollars, and now in the thousands of dollars. There are a few recent announcements that they're in hundreds of dollars. I'm not sure those are real, but it's coming down in price. The scale of precision is getting finer and finer at an exponential pace. Right now it's in microns, millions of a meter. It It will be in billions of a meter, nanometers, which will be true nanotechnology within 20 years. But that's not an artist's conception. That's an actual picture of a violin that was printed out on a three-dimensional printer. Somebody printed out an airplane in modules and snapped them together and flew in it on a three-dimensional printer. Today, with your three-dimensional printer, you can print out 70% of the parts you need to build another three-dimensional printer. And that'll be 100% within 10 years. So ultimately, this is going to revolutionize manufacturing. We ultimately will be able to print out clothes. You can have your avatar in your three-dimensional virtual reality environment and then dress it with different fashions and then actually print out the clothes right on your desktop three-dimensional printer. This is going to revolutionize manufacturing, which is why I say that the future is not in manufacturing jobs. In fact, already in the United States, for example, 1/3 of the population worked in factories in 1900. It's down to 3% today. It's really going to be in creating the intellectual property and the intellect that goes into all of these industries. This is actually where 2045 comes from. This is a cover story in the American magazine Time magazine about this idea, my idea of the law of accelerating returns. They wanted to print that graph, and they said, hey, we want you to put this one computer on it that we covered a few weeks ago. So we put it on there, and it's right on the curve. This is a curve that I laid out in 1981, and it's still exactly correct in terms of the power of computation. It's an exponential graph, so this represents exponential growth that's going to continue well into the future. The last important area I want to cover, because I want to leave some time for questions, is on the brain. I've been thinking for 50 years, and I'm writing a book that's coming out actually this fall called How to Create a Mind, The Secret of Human Thought Revealed. It really describes what I mentioned earlier, which is this key algorithm in the neocortex that's repeated 300 million times, and it's self-organizing, and that the connections from one conceptual level to the next are made by these modules themselves. So not only does our brain create our thoughts, but our thoughts actually create our brain, quite literally, and we can actually see this now. And this is all scaling up exponentially. There are many different projects, like the Blue Brain Project, to simulate the neocortex. There's one system, Watson, which can actually deal very intelligently with human language. It's able to deal with questions in Jeopardy, which are very subtle uses of language, using humor and puns and metaphors. It requires accessing all of human knowledge. And this system actually read in natural language all of Wikipedia in English and several other encyclopedias. It actually read 200 million pages and mastered it all, and can come up with any information from those 200 million pages within 3 seconds. And it's based on models that are very similar to what I'm describing. Markov models, actually, or the mathematical equivalent. But this is a simulation of a slice of the neocortex. All of this is scaling up at an exponential pace. There are working simulations of the human auditory cortex, where we process sound, the visual cortex, the cerebellum, where we do our skill formation. For example, catching a fly ball. The kid does that without thinking about it, although she has to learn how to do it. I always wondered, how does that work? A child is relating, is seeing the ball go up in the air and then moves her hand and catches the ball. In order to do that, you have to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations in 2 seconds. And most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. So we wondered how that worked. The cerebellum actually solves those equations. That's how it works. And we've actually figured that out. And there are working models and simulations of the cerebellum. So let me address one more thing, and then we will have time for questions, which is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's actually a very popular or influential public perception or movement that the world is getting worse, that the world is getting more violent, the poor are getting poorer, the environment is getting worse, the world in general is getting poorer. Turns out not to be the case. I have 50 different graphs like this, which I'll show you just one. Just to make the point, the world's actually getting better. The reason we think the world's getting worse is we have much better information about what's wrong with the world. So if there's a battle in Fallujah, it's not far away. It's right, we're there. It's right on our palm tops. We experience it. So when there are problems with poverty or health or conflict or war somewhere in the world, we hear about it, and very often we can't solve it right away, so we're frustrated because we're empathetic creatures, and we want to solve problems that we hear about. And so people get frustrated and think things are getting worse. It's not like these problems didn't exist. In fact, they were much worse. There's a recent book by Steven Pinker that actually human conflict and violence has been steadily coming down, despite all appearances, because you hear about violence all the time, but actually there's much less of it in the world than there's ever been. The world is healthier. Human longevity was 20 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800. It's now pushing 80. So this graph, it's a moving graph. This is 1800, and these are all countries. The big red circle is China. Actually, watch China because it does some interesting things. And this is on two different scales. On the x-axis, it's the wealth of nations, it's income per person, actually GDP per capita. And it was in the hundreds of dollars on average in 1800. On the y-axis, it's life expectancy, which was in the 20s and 30s, depending on where you were. Average, worldwide average, 37. So let's see what happened. This is now the early industrial revolution. A few countries are experimenting with new industry and are making some progress. China's bouncing around. And if we get to the 20th century, this picks up pace, and while there is a have-have-not divide, a gap, there's a wind that carries all of these nations towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph, towards greater longevity and greater wealth. And this is not stopping, it's not slowing down. Here's a snapshot of 2009. This is going to continue. In fact, it's going to go into an even higher gear because of this acceleration of the pace of change, this ongoing exponential growth of information technology, the greater purview of information technology and its influence on everything. So there's still a divide. The rich nations are still better off than the poor nations, but the poorest nations in the world are actually much better off than the richest nations were at the beginning of this process. So I'll show you one last, well, let me show you just a couple things. People say, well, you know, if we live longer, we're going to run out of resources. We're already running out of energy, and it's not true. We're running out of energy only if we limit ourselves to 19th century technologies. For example, solar energy, we have 10,000 times more sunlight than we need to meet 100% of our energy needs. In other words, we only have to capture 1 part in 10,000 of the sunlight falling on the Earth to meet all of our energy needs. The cost per watt of solar energy on this graph here is coming down very quickly. As a result, the total amount of solar energy Anyway, I had a graph showing smooth exponential growth of the total amount of solar energy. For the last 25 years, it has doubled every 2 years. Very smooth exponential growth, doubling every 2 years. And it's only 7 doublings away from meeting 100% of the world's energy needs, which means that right now it's meeting 1% of the world's energy needs. So people say 1%, that's insignificant. Fringe player, they dismiss it, but they ignore this exponential growth, which is the same thing we did with the internet or with the Genome Project. But it's only 7 doublings in 2 years each to meet 100% of our energy needs. And there are many other exponentially growing energy technologies as well. There's similar stories for clean water, for food, that are coming from new technologies.
Raymond, let me just remind you that in this country, in Moscow, the way to the airport takes twice more time every year. Don't be late, I mean.
So here is the progress we've made. Here's the progress we've made on longevity so far. This is when health and medicine was not an information technology. It was hit or miss, but it was still very useful. And this is going to go into high gear now that health and medicine has become an information technology. And we have the means of literally reprogramming our biology away from disease and away from aging. And many of these technologies are really gaining fruition. There was just, the day before yesterday, a major announcement that if you have a heart attack, if you had a heart attack, half of the survivors have a damaged heart and are therefore very weak. My father had this condition, he could hardly walk. You could now get that fixed with stem cell therapies that actually regrow your heart. That's just one example. We're going to be able to regrow every organ in the body to be younger and free of disease. So hang in there. It'll be I think, a very interesting future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. It was really, really impressive. И меня очень лично впечатляет то, что я не знаю, как этот человек успеет на свой самолет. So my idea, just 2 questions and 5 minutes of limit. Raymond, will it be on time? 2 questions and 5 minutes. У нас, к сожалению, лимит 5 минут и 2 вопроса. Я готов предоставить микрофон. Да, прошу, не забывайте, пожалуйста, представляться.
Добрый день, буду короток. Константин Курилов, Калининград. Но у меня личный вопрос такой, потому что приезд такого феноменального человека в Россию необычен. Скажите, Рэй, как выглядит ваш рацион питания?
И сокращается ли он каждые 10 лет?
I've actually written 3 health books. The last 2 are with a medical doctor. And we talk about 3 bridges to radical life extension. Bridge 1 is what you can do right now, based on today's knowledge. Bridge 2 is what I was talking about when we get really to the mature phase of the biotechnology revolution. Phase 3 is nanotechnology, for example, blood cell-sized devices that can go inside the bloodstream and keep you healthy from inside. That will really provide very dramatic extensions to human longevity. So the goal right now is actually to get to these future points in good shape, alive and doing well. So you don't have to deploy today's methods to live hundreds of years. You just have to get to, actually by our estimate, 15 years from now will be the mature part of the biotechnology revolution. So a lot of these books that I've written are about how to do that, what to practice today. And it involves there's nothing faddish about it. It's eating healthy fats rather than unhealthy fats. So healthy fats, for example, are omega-3 anti-inflammatory fats, or extra virgin olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat. Unhealthy fats are eating too much meat products. For example, eating healthy carbs like vegetables, legumes, fruits, to some extent. Avoiding unhealthy carbs like sodas and pastries. So I follow these kinds of recommendations. I take quite a few supplements to reprogram my biochemistry. I was diagnosed actually with type 2 diabetes 30 years ago. And I completely got rid of it through using this approach, and I had no indication of type 2 diabetes because of my own diet. I also inherited my father's disposition to heart disease, but I don't have heart disease, again, because of this diet. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. It depends on what your issues are. If you are a person like myself, I'm 64, although I come out younger on biological aging test. And I have some genes that are not healthy that dispose me to type 2 diabetes or heart disease, then there's actually a fair amount that you need to do, which I do, and I'm able to stay healthy. If you're a 25-year-old without any health problems, there's not a lot you need to do other than wear your seatbelt and eat a reasonably healthy diet.
Перевод просто. Александр Самитин, скажите, пожалуйста, мы говорим очень много о технологии, биологии, компьютеры, но можете ли вы что-то сказать про психологические и социальные процессы? Изучали ли вы это и что-нибудь про это, если можно?
Кто будет следующим президентом России?
We certainly can see already dramatic changes in the political process affected by the tremendous increase in social communication. You see that in the United States, you see that everywhere in the world. This social communication where everybody can communicate with one another is very democratizing, not just politically, but in many other spheres of society. 25 years ago, you went to the doctor was really commanded all of the knowledge in medicine. Now, if a woman has a chronic disease and goes to a doctor, she's in touch with billions of people around the world who have the same condition and absolutely knows everything going on, the latest research, and may very well know more than her doctor does. In fact, we have decision-making, not only decision-making, but actually problem-solving, where groups of, for example, patients are getting together, hundreds of thousands of patients, and actually saying, hey, we have the skills to solve this problem, and we have the motivation, and they are doing collaborative decision-making. So this communication is having a positive effect. Sometimes it's called the wisdom of crowds. Like 1,000 people, 1 million people. And if you harness their collective wisdom in the right way, you can get much wiser decisions than even if you pick the wisest person in that group. So I think we actually are making better decisions, solving problems more effectively with social communication.
Raymond, thank you so much. Really. Спасибо, по-моему, это действительно было впечатляющие принтеры, которые распечатывают наши аватары. Это будет совсем скоро, если я правильно понял. Дамы и господа, сейчас...